these questions will be kind of random, but how do you find your guests, Joyce?
I have never had a problem getting guests. That hasn't been an issue. And even with season 2, I wasn't sure I was going to do another season because it's a long story, but I'm very niche-y, I think. Women in the emerging cannabis industries who want to talk about their story publicly. So people were reaching out to me over the summer. That's how I kind of found them. I also do some networking, a lot of LinkedIn. That's really my best connection space right now, and Clubhouse. Clubhouse is amazing. I don't know if you guys are on it.
Yeah, you're obsessed with Clubhouse. I know this. Tell us what it is, because I'm still not sure I understand what it is, but I know I need to.
So it's an audio social media app where you are able to join spaces where people are talking on different topics, and you can follow your own topics so you can find these spaces. And I follow a lot of cannabis people, obviously. And I found a room that they were talking about Christianity and cannabis. It's every Sunday night, and I just can't get enough of it. So I never talk in it. I just like listen. I can't believe it.
By the way, I should have mentioned up front, I am recording this session for folks that can't attend and such. So, but I don't plan to share this publicly anywhere. So you can swear if you want to, everybody. One other thing that Joyce is very creative with promoting each episode, and I'll give you a quick example of that. So she has an active Facebook presence, and this is something that I do for certain shows. I know, see Evan Shine on the line, Lisa Poff, for both of your podcasts. You like to use audiograms. This is the way this looks, and then I'll have Joyce explain exactly what this is. But it's a post on her Facebook, and it's just a quick video.
I was having lunch with a friend, and I said, it was a marketing friend, and I said, I really want to create something with cannabis, but I don't know what I want to do yet. So the waitress just came, and she poured a bottle of Pellegrino, and I said, that's it. I said, it's a beverage. So from there, that aha moment. And I remember going home and I said, this is what I want to create. I want to create a non-alcohol cannabis infused wine.
So that, not barely 30 seconds, it's a video. And so you'll get people clicking on that maybe as a nice precursor to get them to click on the whole podcast. But yeah, Joyce, tell us about the audiograms.
I think the audiograms get me more attention than anything else. They are shared, they're looked at, they're easy for people to view. I have learned just last week that Pinterest is a really great place for those. I didn't know that. So I'm going to try putting it on Pinterest, which hopefully will drive it back to the show. I actually don't know if it makes people listen to the show more, but they're more aware of the show and how I'm selling sponsorships is, it's not just list downloads, it's really engagements, social media engagements, and that's a really good one.
So Pinterest, we know that Instagram is very visual, and Facebook is usually some combination of, either video or text or what. With Pinterest, I think of Pinterest as selling products. So what do you actually put on there to promote your show?
Well, just the audiogram, and somewhere in the audiogram there'd be somehow, I haven't done it yet. I'm technically inept, you know that, right?
Okay.
Well, so I set up the business page and I didn't connect the website right, but I hire interns. That's how I do my social media stuff, because I can't do it. I can't do it. Mm-hmm. So I hire college students every semester. I've had 5 or 6 at this point. It started because my son is in college, and last summer 2 of his friends worked for me because I think this is funny that this is what I'm doing. Right. So anyway, so we talked today. I set up the business account for Pinterest. That's all I could do. And then they're going to look at it and figure out what the next steps are. Because my social media, they do it all on Hootsuite. So they organize everything ahead of the time, and it comes out later. I don't know how Pinterest works into that algorithm. They might have to do something separate for that.
So although it's a niche podcast, of course, Joyce wants to be the queen of canna moms everywhere. And so...
Oh, no, I want to be the Terry Gross of cannabis.
Right. That's what she wants to be. But you've said that from the beginning. I stand corrected. But and you're testament to the fact that you need to be in this for the long haul. And it took you a while, but you are starting to see a significant uptick in the audience, which is great. What are your challenges now? What do you need?
So the issue with cannabis, anything, and so the behind the show is this isn't my natural habitat. I was a lawyer. I got into cannabis really because I became invisible because I was a mom and I was taking time off from work and whatever. In 2016, when they legalized cannabis here in Massachusetts, I also ended up losing a job. And then in 2017, I thought I'd go into cannabis law. That's how I started. But I went into this media thing. So I didn't know anything about cannabis or podcasting.
Right.
But I ended up with this podcast in 2019 because I left the place I was working, and it was almost out of desperation to keep this going. But it's just, I've done it for 2 years. It's a system, like it's an organizational thing. Like the first year was like Thelma and Louise, like me and my friend. I didn't know if we are going to get out week to week. Like it was ridiculous. And then we finally ended up with Dave. Like that was great because I just don't know what I can do and can't do. But I'm at the point where I'm finally asking for sponsorships and people are like, yeah. And my numbers aren't really that big. My biggest challenge in cannabis is that you can't advertise. Like it's like I tried to get a bank account. Like I couldn't even start this business. I trademarked the name. I set up the cannabis. It's incorporated, and the idea behind it is to shred the stigma. And I intentionally set it up as the Cannabis Show, which is why I couldn't get a bank account until March of 2020.
Yeah, it took you a while.
Yeah, I have business issues like that's, so I'm at the marketing point. That's where I am, but this is good because I want to reach out to other podcasters to start doing that, like talk about my show, 5 minutes on your show, and then someone talks about, so we're drawing each other's audiences, but we're not necessarily a guest. I think that's my next challenge.
Yeah, you and I have talked about that. And could there be a small, cadre of people, of cannabis podcasters that you could get on a regular call like this one, but much more niche, and actually share ideas for guests and things like that. And then you potentially share all of your mutual audiences, which I think is a great idea. Any questions or comments for the Canamom? You've got her here. It's a rare opportunity. Anyone? That's all right. I guess the last question I'd ask you, Joyce, is what do you enjoy about it?
I mean, I love meeting these women. I mean, the joke is I went into this to make money. When I started this, it was 2019, I left the media company I was working for, and I started on my own. I had 2 kids in college, and my husband's like, really? You're going to start a new thing? I'm like, oh, it'll be fine. What could happen?
Yeah.
Anyways, I persevered, and like those ladies kept me alive during, like, this is the most normal thing in my life, like talking about pot in my daughter's childhood bedroom. So this podcast is like, even though it hasn't monetized itself really, I don't know, it just engaged me in the world. That's what I like about it.
And, the monetization, and John will get into that a little bit, that when he covers that in his presentation, but it just absolutely takes a lot of patience. And what I always tell people is don't sell based on your numbers. Don't sell because, agencies will put advertisers on your podcast. They'll be very happy to pay you for that. But the only thing is you need 10,000 listeners per episode to even get in the door. And so that's a threshold, quite frankly, most of us will never cross without some significant luck and probably 5 or 10 years of working on this thing. But that's not to say you can't have a sponsor. We've had many sponsors of our clients. You have to sell on the concept. And that's what I think you've done well, Joyce. And the people that are interested in your show are going to be those in the cannabis industry. Joyce always highlights a cool product. I don't understand some of them, but they're all very interesting in and around cannabis. And she's really an evangelist for the use of cannabis for good. And you can tell this woman is not a stoner. She's a lawyer. And but I've learned a lot about it. And so,
and the truth of it, these women, like, so almost to a T, these women who are in this industry have healed themselves with this plant. I mean, literally. And a lot of them were on that long pharmaceutical route of like going down that rabbit hole because they worked somewhere where they couldn't use cannabis. Anyway, so, these women are out there because they understand the power of it, and they are not going to give up. This is a very hard industry to be in. It's very hard for banking, for payment processing, just community stigmatization. But these women who are in it that I'm talking to, they're in it for the long haul, and they're going to do what they need to do. And that's really impressive. And they've convinced me, like, I'm on board. Like, my mother still thinks I'm in a drug cartel, but I'm in it.
Keith D, you have your hand up. Was I too late on calling on you, or?
No, not at all. Just wondering where the Manischewitz wine was, but so I just want to know if you're looking to monetize this. Have you thought about a YouTube channel?
Yeah, so I just actually so everything's specialized in cannabis, and I talked to a friend of mine who's in cannabis marketing, and she said I have to do a YouTube channel. So I just talked about that this morning with my interns.
Very good.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joyce, for being the guinea pig. So, and I'll provide information after this in case any of you want to reach out to Joyce, or if you know people that would be good guests. Cannabis isn't what it used to be. There are every law firm I know, even accounting firms I know, they have cannabis departments now. I know a lot of you know this in the business world. It's become commonplace. And so if you have people that you know that would be good guests on Joyce's show, reach out to me and we'll get you in touch. So to stay almost on schedule here, I want to introduce our guest. He's going to present he's got some fancy slides, and he's going to present for a little ways here. You'll be able to ask questions along the way, but it's a terrific presentation. And John Gay is a guy I met at a podcast conference when we used to go to conferences in person. He's a Boston native. He is a veteran of the radio industry, and one of these guys that successfully pivoted, started his company, Jag in Detroit Podcasts, and he does a lot of kind of what we do here in Boston with just a little bit of a different spin here and there, but he's also a great observer of the podcast industry. So he's going to tell you a lot of stuff that you don't know, I'm sure, because I didn't. How is that, Jag? I call him Jag because John is so boring, so.
Well, thanks, Dave. I guess it's the backstory about the name is my full name is Jonathan Alexander Gay. And when I got into radio in college at Syracuse in 1998, John Gay was not a name I could really use on the radio. And my initials are JAG. So I went by Jag. That became my radio DJ name for 15 years on the radio, everywhere from Burlington, Vermont to here in Detroit to New Orleans and back. And then when I pivoted out of radio into podcasting, I just kept the branding as Jag because some people knew of me being on the radio here. So I guess, should I play my intro, Dave, for the podcast?
Yeah, go for it.
Right,
I want to hear it.
What's up? It's Andy Grammer with Jag.
Hi, this is Carly Rae Jepsen, and you're listening to Jag.
Hey, everybody, it's Joe Jonas hanging with Jag.
This is Heather Knox with the hottest Jag I've ever seen.
Ryan Seacrest with Jag.
It's B.O.B. checking in with my homie Jag. So much swag with my homie Jag.
It's the Jag Show podcast.
So that's the intro to my show.
Yeah, I think maybe only the Carly Rae Jepsen doesn't hold up as well.
Yeah, well, call me maybe, Dave.
Yep.
So,
sorry, John, but I promise I'm going to shut up now and let you present. But just as a reminder, if you have any questions for John anywhere along the way, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, and feel free to do it during his presentation or hold your questions till afterwards.
Yeah, and Dave, jump in if anybody has a question because I'll see my PowerPoint here. So if you feel free to stop me at any point. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the stuff in here is going to be stuff that you already know. Some of it will be stuff that you don't know. I know everybody's at a different spot along the journey, so this is kind of an all-encompassing thing. Dave, can you see the slides okay?
Yep.
All right, great. So basically, what is a podcast? Portable piece
of
audio.
Jag, you're in preview mode or whatever.
Oh, here we go. Yep. Let me do this. Hang on. Let me get out of this. There we go. And then I want to do, how do I do this? Display settings. Here we go. Is that better?
Yep. And can you turn your gain up a little bit? Because you're a little softer than.
How about this? This a little bit better?
That is better.
Excellent. All right.
Thank you.
So here we go. Podcast, portable piece of audio that can be streamed on demand or downloaded later for listening on any internet-connected device. Why are they growing? Online video is popular. Everybody's talking about video. To Joyce's point a moment ago about YouTube, but audio goes where video can't. I always tell my potential clients, you can't watch a YouTube video while you're driving, or at least you really shouldn't. And we all want content. And this time of social distancing, you have a captive audience, and you get to consume content without staring at the Brady Bunch squares on Zoom, which this meeting, of course, is an exception. We're all tired of Zoom meetings because we all kind of burn out on it for sure. People ask, how did the pandemic affect podcasting in the last year or so? Creation is skyrocketing. Apple gained over 100,000 shows in just the month of October. So it's well over 1 million shows now on Apple Podcasts. And people kind of scattered when the pandemic started, but they found their way back. They found new routines. Some listened more on desktop. Some listened more on later in the day if they were getting up later because they were working from home and didn't have a morning commute in the car. And the world, of course, started to open back up depending on where you are. What's really important as you think about a podcast is who listens to podcasts. This is data from from April of 2019. Edison Research puts out this great survey every year called the Infinite Dial. If you look at this, this is population by income. U.S. population in general on the left, podcast consumers on the right. The gist of this is podcast consumers make more than your average Joe. So you're targeting an audience that is making more money and generally has more education. As you can see on this slide here, they have a little bit higher education, whether it's 4-year or grad school, than the average person. So you're talking to somebody who is better educated, makes more money. As a branding tool, this is huge. Trader Joe's, Inside Trader Joe's was a huge podcast that Trader Joe's paid a lot of money to do. It helps you connect with your super fans. If you know somebody that loves Trader Joe's, they love Trader Joe's, and they want their pumpkin spice JoJo's or whatever it is every year. They took questionnaires from listeners as far as, when is this product coming back? Why is this one gone? Nobody can tell your brand story better than you can, and you can close that marketing loop. In the podcast, you promote your social and other channels. Then on your social, you promote the podcast, and back and forth. Don't get hung up on how much is this podcast going to make? Am I making any revenue off it? The impact can't always be measured that way. It can be used as a branding tool.
John, let me stop you for a sec.
Yeah.
We all love Trader Joe's, but I know you work with professionals as well. Can you give an example of whether it's someone you've worked with or not, someone from the professional world, whether it be professional service or an entrepreneur or something that cares about their brand as well, right?
National Bone Marrow Transplant Link is headquartered here in suburban Detroit, and they are a wonderful organization that works with recipients of bone marrow transplants who are fighting cancer. And we have done 5 seasons doing stories of survivors, doctors, nurses, caregivers taking care of a family member, you name it. And it's been very well received because it fosters that sense of community among what's, compared to the overall population, a pretty small fraction. But generally speaking, it's a community that really can gain knowledge from each other and has empathy for each other because they're all going through this horrible thing of a bone marrow transplant and complications and cancer. It really has done wonders for them.
Good one. Thank you.
All right. Podcasting familiarity. You'll see here that in the last however many years, it's skyrocketed. And as of last year, 75% of U.S. adults 12 and up have at least heard of a podcast. They're at least familiar with a podcast. Oops. Sorry about that.
Take your time, man.
Yeah, here we go. And then of those people, 55% of adults have listened to a podcast. We've crossed that 51% threshold in 2019. In the last month, 1 out of every 3 American adults has listened to a podcast, a little bit more than that. And in the past week, 1/4 of all American adults have listened to a podcast. That tells you how quickly the medium is growing. And this is something that I want to stop on for a second because a lot of people, when they first get into podcasts, they ask about, oh, how do I get to the top of the Apple charts? I want to be on the top of the Apple charts. It's not as important as you think. Apple has some proprietary algorithm that, as best we can guess, has to do with the number of people subscribing in a rolling window. Nobody knows for sure. People find podcasts not by looking at the top of the Apple charts. They search the internet, Google for whatever topics they're interested in, for example, cannabis. They see social media posts from people in their network. They get recommendations from friends and family and other podcast hosts. These ones at the top here are the big ways you find podcasts. So that's why you want to have your show notes work well for SEO. If you have a chance to put a transcript in, that can help as well. Get your stuff on social media, whatever social media platforms your audience is in, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever it is.
So, John, stay on that side for a second.
Sure.
I think one of the lessons here, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you have to go down to number 5 to get to advertising on other audio programs.
Mm-hmm.
So the top 4 are really ways that the podcaster or podcaster's team can do for free. So it seems like, at least when you start out, you don't tend to recommend paid advertising, or do you sometimes? You can tell.
I mean, not really. I have one client who has done Google ads and seems to have had some luck with it. I don't know a lot of podcasters that have really sunk a ton of money in and had it worked out well for that. I just don't see it, to be honest with you. I think getting word of mouth, old school and new school, whether it's somebody speaking or it's social media. And your audience is about quality, not quantity. I would rather have 20 dedicated podcast listeners than 200 people liking my Facebook post, because it doesn't take much effort to click a like on a cat as a lawyer video. It really doesn't. But for somebody to be listening to your podcast, you really have their undivided attention. They're much more engaged, and those eyeballs or eardrums are worth a lot more than just your traditional social media.
So just to stay on that a bit, because I get that question a lot, John, is how much, where should you be in terms of audience? And it seems to be, you're saying it's not that simple a question. If you get to 100 per episode, if you get up to 1,000 per episode,
if you get up to 150 an episode, Dave, you're in the top 50% of all podcasts out there. So if you're doing pretty well, because you got to figure there's a million podcasts. There's the West Wing while eating wings. Some of them aren't that good. So you've got a chance to do pretty well, and those 150 people listening. That is fantastic compared to however many people liking your Instagram post.
Yeah, I like to tell people, it's if you held a speaking engagement over a luncheon or something, and you had the rapt attention of 150 people, that's absolutely worth doing, particularly if they're people you want to be in front of.
Absolutely, couldn't agree with you more. Obviously, how does your podcast get distributed? I put this slide in here because I had a conversation with someone I know on Sunday night who had a great podcast and had maybe 200 downloads for his first 8 episodes. I said, oh, let me check it out. And I couldn't find it. I said, where's your podcast? Oh, it's on the company website. Is it on Apple or Spotify or Google? No, it's just on the website. And it was something that was obvious to me and obvious to a lot of people in podcasting. Not everybody knows this. Through no fault of his own, nobody ever told him, put it on Apple and Spotify and Google so people can find it. The only way people were finding it was by listening to it on the website, and he was losing so much potential audience by not being on the apps. As Dave alluded to earlier, these are the big 3. In the U.S., at least, Apple is still, depending on who you ask, 60 to 70% of all app listening. Apple Podcast is the dominant number 1. Spotify's making a run at them. They're still a distant second, but they're closing fast. And Google Podcast is a distant third. And then everybody else after that. These 3 are the big cojones right here. Kahunas, not cojones. Sorry. How can you share your podcast? You can share a link. You can also embed a player on your website. Those of you in Boston may know Mistress Carrie from WAAF. She was on.
I'm not seeing that slide, Jag. I'm still stuck on the old slide.
You'd think I've done this a couple times. Let's see.
It's okay.
Let's try this here. From current slide. Can you see? Oops, let me swap it here. Can you see Mr. Scary now?
No.
Oh, let's try this. How about?
Yes, now we can.
Okay.
In preview mode, but
here we go.
Perfect.
All right, so Mistress Carrie, longtime host on WAAF, Boston radio station. I had her as a guest on my podcast after I worked with her to get her podcast going. She has a very recognizable brand in the Boston area. So she just hit 100,000 downloads on her show. She's killing it because she had a brand to build off of. So she had a little bit of a head start. But the point of this slide is you can embed a player that will have all your episodes on a website. For the non-technically inclined, if they can't listen to you on an app, they can listen to you on a website. Send them a link and click on it. As you prepare your podcast, one of the first questions you ask is who? Who is hosting your show? Who will your guests be? Who are you targeting? And most importantly, who am I speaking to and why do they want this? So important to think about. As you grow, as radio DJs grow up, they go from what do I want to talk about to what does my audience want to hear? It's a valuable lesson. One of my early mentors in radio told me that doing a radio show, or in this case a podcast, is like driving a NASCAR. You do all your work in the pit, So when the race starts, all you've got to do is drive. The more prep work you put into your podcast, the better. We've all heard podcasts that start people cracking the mic saying, no, what do you want to talk about today? No, I don't know. What do you want to talk about today? I work with a number of financial advisors, and the ones that have the best shows send me bullet points ahead of time. The ones that don't have good shows refuse to send me the bullet points, and we're jumping on the call, and I'm saying, what do you want to talk about today? And the difference. But they pay me either way. So with the beginning of the Canna Mom show with Joyce, Joel Saul Seahigh, Stacking Benjamin's podcast here outside Detroit. Eliminate friction, surprise, and delight. What he means by that is don't do anything that's going to annoy your audience. If a Marriott guest walks into a hotel, they decide to like that hotel in 2 minutes. They walk around the lobby before they even get to their room, before they even check in. They decide if they like it. Hook your listener first and save all your promotions at the end. I like to think of it as a business transaction. Only ask for something from your audience, a follow on social, a click, an email, after you've given them something of value. If you just ask for them to follow you before you do anything, it's not gonna work.
So what's your standard ask at the end of your show, John?
For mine, I plug my website because my social's on there. I say, if you want more information about my podcast services, find me at jagindetroit.com. I may also say, if you want, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app. But that's it. I don't do a long laundry list. I say I pick a couple, and that's about it.
Yeah, and it's good advice. There's no right or wrong answer as to what the ask is, but experts like John are unanimous in that the biggest mistake you can make is reading off like 4 or 5 things, because after that, people forget and won't do anything.
People have limited attention spans. You don't want to overwhelm them. And the slide that I accidentally passed over is a car in a lake with a helicopter above it. It's the beginning of a James Bond movie. Every James Bond movie starts with a car chase or something blowing up or exploding. You get somebody's attention out of the gate. So, like, Joyce had a great intro at the beginning of her show. If I've never seen or listened to the Canna Mom show, now I know, okay, well, this is what the show is about. This is what I can expect. You may not have an exploding car at the beginning, but if you have set me up to say, here's what I want, here's what I'm going to offer you, you've got to give me a reason to listen, rather than talking about, say, the diner down the street for 20 minutes at the beginning of the show. In terms of metrics, your podcast host will, of course, give you this: all-time downloads, recent downloads, what your top episodes are. This is from a financial advisor that I work with. How people are listening to your show. In this case, Apple Podcasts was the dominant way people listened. As you can see on there, 2/3 of all listening. The Simplecast web player was next. And then you got Google Podcasts and Spotify down there as well. One of the biggest questions I get asked is, how long should the show be? I have produced and listened to shows that are 5 minutes. I've produced and listened to shows that are 2 hours. But the longer your show is, the better it needs to be, because you need to get people's attention. Shorter is better. I recorded with the same one I was talking about earlier, National Bone Marrow Transplant Link. We interviewed a cancer doctor here in Detroit. He was phenomenal. We're planning on half an hour. He answered all the questions, and she looked at me and said, how long was that? And I said, 15 minutes. And she says, well, what do we do with the next 15? I said, nothing, because we got everything we needed.
So not only can they vary in terms of length, but you're saying don't stress being consistent from episode to episode.
No, a lot of my clients, I say we shoot for half an hour, but if it ends up being 22 minutes and 43 seconds or 36 minutes and 5 seconds, that's fine. Cover the material, and then when you're done, you're done. Don't feel like, oh, I've got 5 minutes left to fill here at the end. If it's natural and it's flowing, great.
Yep.
But if it's not, forget it. Just wrap it up. And
you can usually tell. I mean, John has been crapping on rambling conversations while I celebrate them, as people will know. But there's I think there's a zone of agreement in that. I like to say parentheses are great, going down a road great. And Evan Shine, I'll pick on you. So Evan, we work on a podcast called the Shine On Podcast. Evan's a family attorney and has done great work to get great guests on. But I think yours has varied from guest to guest in terms of length. Is that right, Evan?
Yeah, I think that's right. Whether it's been, I think, 40 minutes to, I think some have been hour 10 minutes, hour 15.
Yeah. And that is, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think it was a case of certain guests just were, compelling and had a lot to say. And it was a natural conversation for an hour and 10, whereas different guests you might have wrapped up having covered what you wanted. Right?
Yeah, and I think, as we talked about, I think it's, you sort of try to feel it out, based on the guest, based on the what they're giving you, the information, and sort of where you want to go with it. But yeah, I mean, I try to take it, each episode at a time. So
there you go.
Because it's hard stopping someone if you feel like they're really into the conversation. So I guess the question would be, how do you sort of figure that out and without changing course, at a certain point in the episode. So
that's a great question, Evan, and I think there's two ways to do that. One, as a host, is you can sort of gently say, this is a great story, but I do want to get back to this topic of whatever it is, or you rely on somebody like Dave or myself to do some editing for you.
Yeah, exactly.
And you say, okay, well, listen, let's cut from here to here. This is where he went on a tangent that's not really relevant. I'd like to cut this out here. There are a number of transcription services that are offering pretty inexpensive transcripts of podcasts that AI generate. They're about 80 to 90% accurate. You can kind of eyeball it and say, okay, I want to cut from here to here, which is a lot easier than listening to the file and taking notes all the way through. So you can kind of eyeball it to edit content. I'm a big fan of doing that.
Got it. That's helpful. Thanks. And Dave does, such a great job with that and giving updates throughout the show.
Absolutely. With homage to my adopted home of Detroit, Aretha said, respect to your audience. You want to avoid endless banter and tangents. Poor quality audio will send people away right away, especially if they're checking out your show. And even if you fix it later, if your show pops up for them somewhere, they'll say, oh, I listened to that show, wasn't any good. They're not going to give you a second chance. The whole one chance at a first impression thing. Inconsistent volume. You've been listening to a podcast, all of you, I'm sure, in a car where one co-host kind of sounds like this, and the other co-host sounds like this, and you're either blowing your eardrums out or craning to hear over the road noise. Keep the host at reasonable volume. How do I make money on a podcast? Another common question. You're not likely to do it, as Dave was mentioning, until you hit 10,000 downloads an episode. So you can try to get thousands of downloads or find a sponsor in your niche. I'll go back to Joyce from earlier. I always say if you have a podcast about basket weaving, you might only have 20 listeners, but I bet you there's a basket company that would love to get in front of those 20 dedicated listeners. A friend of mine named Stacy Sims, I'm going to plug her website here. She hosts a podcast called Diabetes Connections. Her teenage son is a type 1 diabetic, and she has gotten a number of sponsors from the medical community, whether it's glucose monitors, all kinds of stuff that is involved with the treatment of diabetes. She has done a tremendous job, and she actually has a quiz and a thing on her website about finding out if you're ready to monetize your podcast or not. So that is the link there. You can screenshot that or jot that down. Her website is her name, stacysims.com/podcast-quiz if you want to check that out. And you can feel free to tell her I sent you. She does a great job.
I'll share that information later. And Jag, do you have a version of this that you can make available to the public, your presentation? Or
I certainly can, yep.
Okay, I'll follow up with you later, and but there's been a couple requests here. So, and
absolutely.
Yes, don't let me interrupt you at the most important part. Go ahead.
Yeah, you saw the plug in the previous slide.
Yeah.
I'll do a lot of the same stuff Dave does. I help you conceptualize the podcast from start. I work with a lot of small businesses and individuals and nonprofits. I'll do the whole deal, produce, put the music in, put the voiceover up, app up. I will set it up and get you up your I can't talk tonight. I'm sorry. I'll get you on your podcast apps as well. So, or I have clients that record their own podcasts and they MP3 me or send me the WAV file of the podcast and I edit it and put it together for them. So I have different levels of service, and I've started dabbling in offering video as well. So I'm kind of the Dave of Detroit, but part of my heart is, of course, still home in Boston. So
yes, and I recommend John wholeheartedly. There are a host of reasons why you might use John instead of me, and
reasons why you might use Dave instead of me. So it's
there are more of those actually. There are a lot of those, yeah. But for sure, if there are people in part of the country where Jag is, you can certainly put them in touch. But I encourage people to reach out to Jag either way. So. Any questions for John? He covered a lot, and which is kind of what I wanted for a first meeting, to kind of cover the basics from start to finish. But any questions? Again, if you prefer to put them in the chat, you can. Oh, we do have a hand raise. Okay, hold on. I'm figuring out. Joyce, is that your virtual hand? No.
My actual hand, and that's
Okay.
Lisa's virtual hand. Does she get to go first? Or?
Yeah, she does because she followed directions. But sorry, Lisa first, and then Joyce. Lisa, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. And Dave, this is something you and I talked about, and I wanted to sort of get a second opinion. Sorry about that. But we recently launched a podcast, and it's my CEO that is actually interviewing some illustrious guests, and some maybe that are not as well known but have interesting stories. Mm-hmm. But we're producing this every 2 weeks, and so there's been this thought of, should we be going out every week instead of every 2 weeks, and maybe having a season and then taking a break, and then how long do you take a break before you start your next season, versus this schedule that we have of this kind of every 2 week cadence to kind of build an audience. I just would love your thoughts on that.
Great question. I think the key, Lisa, is consistency.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine with it going out every 2 weeks. If okay, it's every other Thursday, I'm going to the show. One of the shows that I listen to is Pod Save America, which some of you may know. It's a bunch of former Obama staffers that started a podcast to comment on their feelings on the Trump White House. So it was interesting at times, without taking sides there. But they come out every Monday and Thursday. And I know every Monday and Thursday night to look forward in my feed. I know, there's a Patriots podcast I follow, Tom Curran's Patriots Talk podcast that comes out sometimes inconsistently, and it's a little frustrating if they're off schedule. So I would say if you're on every 2 weeks, that's fine. If you do decide you've kind of hit the limit of what you're going to do for now and you want to take a break, yes, you can do that. Tell your audience that you're taking the break, and then you can also do a different season. I know for myself, for my own podcast, which is just called The Jag Show, I did one season when I was just dabbling in it and I didn't have a focus, and I just wanted to interview interesting people who had stories to tell, just to sort of get some reps in podcasting. So I made that season 1. And then I did it for a little while, and then I stopped. That was season 2. And for a while, I was doing a weekly 5-minute recap on what was going on in the world of podcasting. That was season 3. I'm taking a break from that now, and if I come back to it and do something else, that'll be season 4. But if you want to build momentum, I would definitely say keep a consistent schedule. It's every other Thursday. Another trick that I learned when it comes to releasing, I will schedule my podcast sometimes to release overnight, like maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. And the reason I do that is because it sometimes takes Spotify or Apple or whomever a little while to refresh their feed and show up with new content. So if you publish it at midnight or 3 a.m., that will give it a few hours overnight to refresh. And when your listener gets up in the morning, boom, it's right at the top of their feed.
Yeah, I like that idea. One of the other things that we're doing too is we're featuring on our website the next release. So who's coming up? So we're trying to get some momentum for people to be excited about what's coming up.
You're promoting, and then you're promoting after it comes out. That's terrific. That's the way to do it.
Yes.
Just to give Lisa a plug, since she's being humble, it's her colleague is Mike Nathanson of the Colony Group. The name of the podcast is Seeking the Extraordinary, and we've already posted episodes including interviews with the likes of Boomer Esiason and Ty Law and Jim McCann, the founder of 1-800-Flowers. And so Mike is calling in all his powerful friends to chat with, which is cool. But they're great stories. Joyce, go ahead with your question, please.
Oh, so I love that you said that thing about having like not a lot of engagements, but dedicated listeners. So that's myself, right? When I talk to, they're like, they want to reach, whatever, I get 150 downloads a week or something, but they're consistent and they've been going up. All right. That's actually really good to know.
Yeah. John, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but the consistent, what I told you, Joyce, is you can't, and John alluded to the fact that Apple is very mysterious about releasing like practically any data whatsoever, even though we all want people to subscribe on Apple Podcasts. But when you start to see consistency, even if it's at, in the hundreds or 100 or 125 or whatever it is, it likely means you have a lot of subscribers and you have people that are tuning in. One of the things that I tend to recommend is some degree of feedback, even if it's just mentioning a listener or two from show to show, because I think that makes it a real interactive. So let's see, Evan, we did picking on Evan again, but Evan, you picked off a couple comments that people wrote in, and It was great. And he said, producer Dave, could you just read that stuff? And so I read it. We took a couple listener questions. To me, that's great because it develops loyalty. And what you really want to do is develop ambassadors that are going to share your show with others. Because you saw John's slide about where people find podcasts. You know, one of the top two was it's so-called word of mouth, but by word of mouth, it's, you know, your friend posted it on Facebook and said, stop what you're doing, listen to this podcast right now. Well, if that person is a big network, then you just got another, you know, a dozen subscribers or maybe more. Who knows?
Dave, your point about reading listener feedback, it goes back to my time in radio. You're making a connection with your listener. If if you grew up in Boston and you listened to Maddie in the morning, you felt like you knew Maddie because you grew up and, drove to work or to school with him every day, or whether it was WBZ or whoever it was, or Dale Dorman, or, you go back and you got all these great Boston DJs. Yep. But you feel like you knew them because they had that intimacy of audio, and if they recognize you, that creates that bond. I want to go back to the other point about quantity versus quality of listeners. I will tell you guys, between us kids, my Jag Show podcast, which is a 5-minute podcast about the podcasting industry, I was getting about 20 downloads an episode, just 20. But I was promoting it on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and Instagram every week. Cheat, by the way, if you can share a Spotify link to Instagram stories if you're looking to promote your podcast on Instagram, if you didn't know that. So I was promoting it every week, just on my network personally on Facebook. There was a guy that I knew from 10 years ago when I was a radio DJ in Burlington, Vermont, probably 15 years ago now. He was a local TV guy, and now he works at a PR agency in Boston. And he said, hey, I have a client that wants to start a podcast. Can I connect them with you? Well, it turns out this client is an international venture capitalist firm. And I'm now doing podcasts with 2, possibly 3 different teams within this company. And I was able to raise my rates because they're a big, giant international VC firm. So the reason I tell this story is not to brag. The reason I tell the story is I was sharing it with my network, and it wasn't about how many listeners I had, but the podcast was a branding tool for me and my business, and that's how I landed one of my biggest clients yet, by consistently promoting the podcast on social media, which is why it can be a great thing for businesses.
And that's such a great point, because it lives forever. And so when people are Googling you, Max Perlman's an employment lawyer. We produced a podcast for his colleague, John Graff. And when people Google, John Graff, higher education lawyer, or perhaps the name of a guest on his podcast or something, that's going to pop up. And so before people hire someone like Max or his colleague or whatever, they will most likely take a listen to the podcast. I've had people that have appeared just one episode on my podcast. I had a guy who was a mediator. He said, I really got to thank you because I've gotten a couple clients from your show. I said, really? He said, well, what happens is the person hears about me, they Google me, and your podcast with me is one of the first that comes up. So of course they're going to listen, because how better are you going to get to know somebody than by listening to a conversation with them rather than just, their bio or LinkedIn page or whatever. Joyce, if we haven't answered your question.
And then I love that you said that sort of ambassador going with other podcasters thing is like the 4th on that list, because that is sort of what I've been thinking about. So that's my time. That's where it's well spent, connecting with other podcasters. And
yeah, I think so. And Joyce, you and I can have our huddle afterwards as usual, but I think you've tapped into something great with the niche, and what I've told you is you're building this mountain of relationships in the cannabis industry, and it's paying off already, but it will continue to pay off because of the relationships that you formed just by having guests. And I know you've welcomed people on your show who have podcasts themselves, which is a great move. Anyway.
Dave,
they could win the quilt, Dave. My ambassadors could win the quilt. Maybe that's where the quilt's going.
Dave, I have a message from somebody here in the chat that was sent to me privately. It says, Jag, how do you go about getting a sponsor? How do you approach someone in your industry or collateral industry to support the podcast? The easy answer to that question is, if you're talking about the podcast and you have a listener of the podcast who engages with you, then you don't have to sell the podcast because they've heard the podcast and they understand what the podcast is all about. That's obviously the easiest way for it to happen. But I also think that it doesn't hurt just to ask somebody in the industry. So at a convention that I was at, again, the same guy, Joel Salsihai here in Michigan, he has a podcast called Stacking Benjamins. And it's a financial podcast. It's a financial literacy podcast, and he was at a financial convention, and he approached one of the big guys. I don't know if it was. I'll say Fidelity. It may have been Fidelity. It may have been somebody else. He approached the guy and he's like, "Yeah, you want to sponsor our podcast?" And the guy's like, "How much is that?" And he just pulled the number out of his wallet and said,
Yeah.
"I don't know, $100 an episode." What's $100 an episode to Fidelity? Like, yeah, sure. I got that in my couch cushions for you. So I think sometimes it's a matter of if you have somebody who's already engaging with the podcast, again, that's the easiest route. But approaching people in that industry that you're in, if it's a branded podcast, or in, or in Joyce's case, in a specific field, finding people that maybe finding people that sponsor other things. If they may not necessarily be a podcast, finding things in your field that are sponsored or have money tied to it by, a different company. Say, hey, I saw you're a sponsor of this. Listen, I've got this podcast that I think is right up your alley. Would you be interested in sponsoring it? And I think, there's a natural hesitation for those of us that aren't salespeople by trade to sell yourself and pitch yourself, and sometimes imposter syndrome comes in. But if you're if you have a podcast, you're already passionate about it. It shouldn't be hard to sell because you already have a passion for what you're doing, and you're just talking about it.
Yeah. A couple other quick tricks of the trade is it's not always appropriate, but you can invite a potential sponsor to be a guest on your show.
Yes.
Let them come on and tell their story. And then right when they're leaving, not right when they're leaving, but down the road, you say, if you enjoyed this podcast experience, how would you like to support the show? And for someone like that, if they like to hear the sound of their own voice, you can put together, people are still making up stuff in the podcast world. Just like John said, $100, that sounds pretty good. You're selling a concept, but you can add, how about once a month you come on the show just to talk about what's for 5 minutes, it'll be sort of advertorial. But
if you're looking for something really specific, for like a real proposal, something really concrete and official, I'd refer you again to my friend Stacey Sims, who does this with her Diabetes Connections show, or as Wilford Brimley would say, diabetes. God rest his soul. She has a really formal way of doing it because she deals with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and drug companies, and they have so many rules and regulations around them that she has really gone to some lengths to have some officially done stuff. So she's a great resource. But yeah, anything you can think to do. And Dave's point is so right. My uncle always says rule number 1 of life is know your audience. There are people who love the sound of their own voice to the point where it's obnoxious sometimes. I include myself in that. My wife would be the first person to tell you that. But if you've got somebody who loves hearing themselves
I have no idea what you mean, John.
Yeah, that's why you had me on, because I can talk. This is a PowerPoint in front of me, then I just can't talk. But there's if you have somebody who likes the sound of their own voice and you say, hey, you want to be a sponsor of the show? We'll have you read the commercial on the show or anything like that. There really is an opportunity there. But again, I think of podcasting first and foremost as a branding tool and as a revenue generator second, except in some cases.
Cool. Well, why don't we pivot here? By the way, we will end promptly either at 6:30 or before 6:30. So we are, as we say in the industry, we're a little bit up against the clock here, but I've got a couple people who I promised I would give some airtime to as examples of podcasts. It'll sort of be a mini version of what we did with Joyce. But in the meantime, if you have questions for John or anyone, keep raising your hand, keep putting questions in the chat if you're so moved. And JP, I guess we'll start with you, and then Laura and Beth, you're next, so don't worry. So JP Plunkett, thanks for joining us today, is I guess a colleague, but a friend of this other guy, Josh Cohen, and they kind of know each other professionally, and they wanted to start a podcast. Well, actually, JP, why don't I have you describe it rather than have me stammer over it? Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. This is fun. So Dave and I see Max on the line. We're in a fantastic business development group, the Blue Hills Business Group, and was a guest on David's show, and it was just a blast. And from there, Josh and I, another guy in the group, with Dave, started a show over the summer. I guess you could call it season 1. That was a very interesting thing that Jag brought up. I think that these smaller podcasts have a little bit of a shelf life in terms of 15, 16 episodes and then take a break like we did. And it was just a ton of fun. It definitely drove our respective business brands. Josh is in the insurance business. I'm commercial real estate. We talked a lot of 40-something nerdy guy, pop culture, sports, movies, TV shows. And I mean, primarily for us, it was a ton of fun. But boy, a super close second. It really, got out there. It was
It's I think don't let me put words in your mouth,
it was a
JP.
conversation starter with clients and friends. It was fun.
Right. And you like so many of us get hired, I think largely based on referrals and people that know you. And this is kind of another way of, it's a combination of marketing and networking. Now, you didn't talk a lot of shop on the show. You being,
Nope.
I should have pointed out, you're a real estate professional. Josh is a financial advisor. It was your passion was elsewhere, to create just a good show that you could use as a, I guess fair to say, personal branding device for you guys.
Correct. And
Yeah.
I think as it went on, we talked close to no shop. I think
Right.
at the beginning we thought we would talk a lot about it, but that went away fast. And somebody referenced earlier, and I couldn't agree more. If we were already talking to a prospect and they Google search you, now they've got your website, they've got your LinkedIn page, but oh wow, look at this. This popped up. This is interesting. And if somebody already knows that you love the Beatles or you love the Red Sox, that helps, continue a conversation on
right.
less fun stuff like office buildings and warehouses.
Yeah, and people that oftentimes, let's be honest, that's what we have a common interest with someone, even if it has nothing to do with your business. It might be a reason you get hired. Just for a kick, before we move on, I'll play a little bit of this one. JP shrewdly reached out to some. He's kind of part of the Boston College mafia. Fair to say, right, JP?
I guess.
And so
you do know how somebody went to Boston College, right, Dave?
They tell you constantly.
Yeah, well, the reason just wait 5 seconds, they're going to tell you. So
Right. Right. I'll play a little bit of this.
Guilty as charged.
Right. But just to show you the sort of the style, I tried to match the intro of this that I created for the style of these guys, and take a listen. From pod617.com, the Boston Podcast Network, it's the Josh JP Philosophy. So here they are, Josh Cohen and JP Plunkett. Josh and JP's guest today, Matt Hasselbeck, former NFL QB and current TV legend.
Thank you, Dave, and welcome to Matt. We're actually here in the studio in Westwood, Massachusetts.
Hey, Westwood.
Not far from where Matt started on the gridiron for Severian Brothers before his Boston College and NFL career, and now TV stardom, as Dave mentioned. But I'd like to thank Matt for being with us this morning very much. And the first question I'd like to ask him is, how does it feel to be, in my opinion anyways, the fifth best athlete in a family of five?
Well, I'm used to it. You mentioned.
So that good first question. You got to the guest right away. And, we did a pretty good job there, I think, patching in Matt remotely. When we can return to my studio, it's, as JP, I think you'll agree, it's fun to record in there. And we got the big screen TV. You can look at your guests and all that. So
I liked going into the studio because it just, to me, it felt like game day. It motivated me a bit more to get excited about it, but I'm a dork like that, and it's 10 minutes from my house, so it was easy. But I also understand that it works really well from your office or your home. That's sort of the flexibility that makes it such a beautiful marketing tool.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, all the podcast, almost all of them, we're doing remotely now, and hopefully that'll change come summer. But I know John, that's Jag, does a lot remotely as well. You can get it to, I don't know, Jag, what would you say? Can you get it to like 90 to 95% of the quality of recording?
Yeah, I'd say it's a pretty good number. I can honestly say since the pandemic, I think I have been in 3 offices recording clients live. Everybody else I've done from the studio I made here in the house. But to JP's point, when it comes, I'll go back to, getting guests and getting sponsors. There's an old radio phrase or advertising phrase, sell the sizzle. And a podcast is cool. If it sounds flashy and big, like Dave's got a nice intro on your show and all that, like there's forgive the word, but there's something sexy about that. And that can be a way that you can bring in a guest, you can bring in a sponsor. Like, don't be afraid to toot your own horn. And, you know, look, so if I can't do my camera here, but I have the Rodecaster Pro, you know, stereo box that's got all these cool light colors that light up on it. I would bring this before the pandemic to potential clients' offices and plug it in and light it up. Oh, look at the cool buttons. It's something so simple, but selling the sizzle can really be something that can be to your advantage to land both guests and clients, customers.
For sure.
Speaking of sizzle, then I'll back away. But another fun one, Dave, that just comes to mind is we had Grace Curley on the show, who at the time was Howie Carr's sidekick. And last month she started her own midday show on RKO 680 AM. And she's just kicking butt and just doing so great. And was more than happy to join us. So
yeah, she was a lot of times people ask how you get guests, and the answer is a lot of times just ask.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I said to Evan when we were brainstorming ideas for his show, you know, you deal with divorce. I think of War of the Roses as the ultimate divorce movie. And Evan said, well, what about Mrs. Doubtfire? And I said, that's great. Now we're not going to get Jane Fonda to be on the show, but maybe we'll get the writer. Evan found the name of the writer. I tracked down the agent, and well, we have a request in. So, but you know, you get creative. You never know who you might get.
We had Dave Wedge, who wrote the Howie Carr. Excuse me, the Whitey Bulger and John Lennon book. I mean, you really do just have to ask.
Yep.
People like to promote themselves. People like the sound.
Free publicity for them.
People like the sound of their own voice. People like to promote themselves. Like, don't be afraid to tap into that and use that to your advantage.
And if it's not obvious, then you get the guest actually marketing for you after the show. The guest will happily share that episode. It was so much fun being on the Josh JP Philosophy. So says Grace Curley, and shares that with her network, and that's another great way to build.
Dave, that's a really good point, because it's easy to get sometimes you can get a guest, the big social following, but you want to make sure that you give them a great experience on your show, so they are likely to post about it. If you've got a show where you don't have Dave with you, or you've got a lot of technical problems, or you have just a contentious interview or something like that, they're probably not likely to promote it. But if you give them a great experience, then you're more likely to get promoted their entire network.
Right. Bill O'Reilly would have been a crappy podcaster. That's not true. He probably has like the third most popular.
Imagine if he had Ludacris on his show.
Let me share one more example. And Beth and Laura, two of my favorite people in the whole wide world, I don't mind saying. They came up with this idea to do a podcast called Twin XL. I'll let them explain the inspiration for it. But actually, before I do, I just want to play a little bit of the intro, and you'll get a flavor for what it's about right away.
If your student is going to live on campus, they will need twin extra long sheets.
The first thing people get wrong. It's the first thing people get freaked out about. The majority of students who enroll in college don't graduate in 4 years.
Is my kid going to make friends? Are they going to fit in? Are they going to find their people at college? Are they going to fail a class?
Between Beth and I, we have worked in higher education for 50 years. We really think that there's some opportunity for some great dialogue.
From the Pod 617 studios in Westwood, Massachusetts, it's Twin XL. Now here's your hosts, Laura DeVoe and Beth Grampetro.
Good morning.
Hey, everybody. Good morning.
Everyone. Yay.
Nice to see you.
It is. It's nice to see everyone.
All right. You're going to have to just tune in yourself to hear the rest of that one. But Laura and Beth, Laura, why don't you start? I just have to start somewhere. Just tell us a little bit about your idea and how you put that together. And you did a terrific season and have since taken a break, but yeah, tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. So Beth and I worked together for a long time at two different places. We worked together at Boston University and then at Mount Ida College before it closed. Actually, we helped close it, but that's another story for another day. And so one of the things that we didn't want to talk about was how to get into college, because we thought that was overplayed. We also didn't want to deal with the kind of elitism and really talking to a specific segment of the population. Whereas, we were talking about like, how do you actually parent your child through college? And so the name, and I'll let Beth talk about the name because she does a better job with that than I do. The whole concept was really about parenting, and Beth and I actually have a good kind of rapport in terms of the back and forth. We both make each other laugh. We both have a pretty deep knowledge of useless information about pop culture. Beth can literally grab a Sex and the City reference out of her ass at any given moment of any time of the day.
That's really, that's contextually very
and
strange.
it's totally contextual, and I think it's completely amazing. And that sort of thing. And so I think we try to keep it as interesting and fun as possible. And in our first season, we covered everything from how to prepare your kid to move into the residence hall, to depression, to using too much alcohol or drugs, and all that kind of stuff. So academics, you want to change majors, you want to go from business major to playing the flute, what? So we went all over the place, and it was a lot of fun, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to toss it over to Beth to talk about where the name came from.
Sure. So anyone who has been to college, lived on campus, or sent a kid to college, you probably figured out that for some weird reason, colleges have long mattresses that are not normal sized, and you have to buy special sheets that are not the right size for any mattress you have in your house. And so that was we just thought it was an interesting name because it's kind of an insider piece of information. I mean, it's really not, but it's one of those things you don't really learn until you experience living on campus or having someone live on campus. And so that was kind of where it came from.
And it's great to have a podcast where I always talk about, you want what they do podcast. It's like, what these people do? They talk about this thing, and it's just the story kind of tells itself. It's in the show intro. You almost just did the show intro, Beth. You said, if you've sent anybody to college, you got to go out and buy those Twin XL. And so once you hear that, you're like, oh, I get it. And so but it's very nicely niched also, because as you say, there are probably a zillion podcasts about how do I get into college, but this one's specifically for the parents who have all these questions about their kids. They're scared to death, like I am now, about my kids' health and well-being and emotional state and all that. Now Beth, would you mind talking about the sponsor? Because you did have a sponsor for a while that I thought was a creative stroke. I don't know how much detail you want to get into there, but.
Is it creative or is it nepotism?
No, but it's okay. So no, but go ahead and say,
that's okay.
Yeah, no, this is a great way to and it lends a lot of credibility. Do you want me to say, or do you want?
No, I can say it.
Go ahead,
My husband's an attorney. His firm advertised for a while. It's weird because it's not really like they're a boutique IP firm, so it has absolutely zero to do with, except that there could be some crossover of like, there are perhaps parents listening who need the services of trademark and patent attorneys.
And right, obviously, your hubby did it as a favor, but nevertheless, I thought it wove nicely into the sound of the show, and we created a read that sounded just very professional. And like whenever you're listening to NPR, they don't have sponsors in the traditional sense, but it's like we kind of made it NPR-ish. Like Twin XL is supported by the law firm of how did I already forget? What was the firm again?
It's actually now Sunstein LLP.
Oh, it was,
which they've cut people off their masthead since we recorded that sponsorship.
Well, we got to get you back into the studio.
Get a new one.
Yeah, well, they need to rebrand. They need to sponsor your podcast. Anyway, but there are little things you can do, and I encourage people, give away sponsorships. Talk to your friend who's got a growing law practice, or even just the sandwich shop down the street, and to be able to do a live read on a show or put a spot into your show, it does lend some. And I'll say this also, that people like on Lisa's podcast, Seeking the Extraordinary, Tom doesn't permit me to play it, but they weave in the presence and the website for the financial services firm, without it sounding salesy at all. And Lisa, I think you'd agree. We talked about this. Actually, Lisa's mellifluous tones are it's actually the voice you hear at the beginning of the show. And you did a nice job, Lisa, just reading. So you can
nobody else volunteered, so I had to do it.
You did great. And so that's just another little tip. So we're close to the finish line here, folks. I want to get everybody out on time. Does anyone have a final question either for John or for me or otherwise? So this will be a monthly tradition. I hope you find it useful enough that you want to continue to learn new things about your podcast and come with questions and things that you've tried that have worked and haven't worked and all that. I'll keep you updated. I promise I won't hound you too bad with the email, but I will follow up this meeting with the future schedule. If you do want to make a note, I can tell you the meetings will be monthly on the 4th Tuesday. So today's Monday, but it just has dawned on me that a lot of Mondays tend to be holidays, so might not be the best. So we're going to go 4th Tuesday. So the next one's March, I think 27th or something like that. I'll send you the whole schedule. And if you know others that are interested in this, I encourage you to do so. If you're already working with us at Pod 617, these meetings will always be on the house. For those that just want these meetings, there's a fee attached, but please, I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it somewhat useful. Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Dave, and thanks everybody for sitting in. I appreciate you having me on and being your guinea pig.
Thank you. You did a fantastic job. And since you're such a pro, I will be a pro as well, and I will play the outro music and say thank you for coming to the Pod Power Roundtable. I hope you made some friends. We'll circulate the information. And as we say here at the Boston Podcast Network, in Pod, we trust. Have a great night, everybody.